Thank you all for coming to the CHEPS seminar this week. We're very fortunate to have Dave Ribar here from the University of Melbourne. He's on sabbatical at Duke University this semester. Dave is at the Melbourne Institute for Applied Economic and Social Research and is the director of the Institute's Economic and Social Disadvantage Research Program. He's one of the top economic demographers in the world, has published in top journals in sociology, in demography, and in economics.
And in Review.
And in Review of Economics of the Household. He's the deputy editor of Demography and the associate editor at Review of Economics of the Household and the Journal of Population Economics. He's published widely in the areas of teen fertility and household formation, and today is going to present a very provocative paper on teenage daughters as a cause for divorce. So thanks so much for being here, David.
So thank you. So I'm really happy to be here, especially happy to be at the Home Institution for the Review of Economics of the Household. This is a paper with my colleague at the Melbourne Institute, Jan Kabatek. Jan joined the Institute about 2 years ago. His research agenda works with administrative data from the Netherlands. So Jan brought the data to the project. I am obligated to say at the outset that the research that you're about to see has been reviewed by Statistics Netherlands for disclosure purposes, and it's okay by them. However, all the conclusions, results, other things are Jan's conclusions and my conclusions, and do not necessarily reflect Statistics Netherlands, nor the Melbourne Institute, nor IZA, nor the Australian Research Council Centre of Excellence for Children and Families over the Life course, for which I'm a node director, and Jan is a paid fellow and who also contributed to this. So I think that takes care of the disclosure part of this. Also, as you can see, I think the copy that you've got is about 87 pages long. This is a paper that's pretty far along, but we are wrapping it up for submission to a journal. So all the comments that you provide will be greatly appreciated. And for anybody who's watching at UNH, any comments that you want to email to me would be greatly appreciated. So with that, let's get started. There was an original title for this paper that we've switched, and the original title for the paper was The Demand for Sons or Demanding Daughters. So the focus of the paper actually came from a larger literature that's broadly defined as the son preference literature. So there's another institution down the road a bit where there's a researcher, Gordon Dahl, who's written a paper on son preferences. And his paper was influential in us picking this up. So we're going to be taking a look at gender effects on family processes, and we're going to be doing that in a developed Western country, the Netherlands. And the first question that some people might have is, why are we looking at gender effects in a developed country setting? So we often think about the gender effects literature as applying to East Asia, South Asia, North Africa. We don't think about it as much in terms of developed countries, but it turns out that there's actually quite a large research literature that has detected gender effects in other settings, most notably in the US. So back in 1981, Spanier and Glick, and this would actually be the Graham Spanier who went on to become the president and then disgraced president of Penn State. So before Graham Spanier had that position, he was a family demographer, and one of his most influential papers is a descriptive paper in the US that just looked at the correlates of divorce. And one of the things that Spanier and Glick uncovered in this descriptive paper was that parents of daughters were at higher risk of divorce than parents of sons. So this was a result that was known to sociologists quite some time ago, but there have been several subsequent studies that have confirmed Spanier and Glick's findings, and have found that sons are associated with more stable marriages, at least in the US. So for some people this may be a little bit surprising, but there is actually a pretty sizable research literature that documents some of the patterns that we're going to find. So there's US evidence, you say. Yes, quite a bit of US evidence. So after Spanier and Glick, another set of sociologists, Phil Morgan and colleagues, re-looked at this using, I want to say, quasi-multivariate techniques, and continue to find the same thing. And then in the late 2000s, so I guess a bunch of working papers that showed up in the mid-2000s and then were all published in the late 2000s, a series of economic studies found that the gender of the firstborn child was associated with divorce in the US. Now, while there have been a number of studies that have found these associations, there are also some issues with some of these. So first of all, the results have not shown up in every study or every data set. So for instance, Morgan and another researcher did a follow-on study where they looked at, their initial study was using the first couple of waves of the current population marriage and fertility supplement, and then when they looked at more recent data, they couldn't find the same patterns for the US. There have been other researchers that have looked at other data sets besides the data sets that are looked at here and have failed to detect patterns for the US. Also, nobody has found evidence outside the US in a developed Western setting. So people have looked in a host of countries, including one comparative study that compared 16 countries at the same time. No evidence in those studies.
So now you're going to talk a lot about the mechanisms that could be at work here. Have some of those international comparisons also driven speculation about?
Not really, because there's no findings. So the international ones, they're just not finding anything.
Why we would see it in the U.S. versus other countries? Has that driven some of the?
I don't think so. They're null enough that they're just So the only quasi finding, there was one Swedish study that used administrative data, and they found a slight association between higher order daughters and divorce, but not firstborn daughters. So one study out of all of these other studies. There are also a bunch of methodological concerns with the studies that were done in the US. So all of the studies that were done for the US used one of two data sources. They either used the decennial census, so the long forms of the decennial census, or they used the current population study marriage and fertility supplements. There's a big problem with using the decennial census for examining these effects. And the problem with the census is that you don't get birth and marriage histories for people. So you can observe whether somebody's married or not. You can observe what the composition of the household is at that time. But you don't know all the children that were born to a particular couple. You don't know if the children who are in the household are actually the biological children children of the couple in the household. So, for instance, the Dahl and Moretti study, they limited their analysis to children who were 12 or younger in a household. And the reason why they did that, if the oldest child is 12, and you can see that the number of children in the household matched the number of children that were ever born to somebody, you can be reasonably certain that the oldest child has not left the household. But they couldn't look at older children because there's a possibility that older children would be selectively in the household. Dahl and Moretti were not able to identify biological linkages between the children. So they didn't know whether the children who were in the household were the biological children, adopted children, stepchildren of the people that were in the household. So all these other problems associated with the data. And again, there have been several studies of developed countries, but again, no associations in those. So, mechanisms. A lot of mechanisms have been proposed. They generally, or at least we've put them into 4 categories. So 2 categories are proposed by economists. The economic hypotheses involve preferences, so a general preference for sons or preferences for time spent with sons. We'll go through these in a little more detail in a bit. There are cost hypotheses that raising daughters may be more costly than raising sons, or that divorce may be more costly for sons than it is for daughters. There are also a related set of sociological hypotheses that describe different types of family processes that might be impacted. So father involvement, which might bring fathers more into the household than they would be otherwise if reinforcement of gendered roles, changes in attitudes if you have daughters versus sons, and something that we'll focus on, which is relationship strains between children and parents. And then also there's some selection stories as well. So the selection story here is that we might think of the gender of the firstborn child or the gender of children as being something that's exogenously determined. But there may be other processes that lead to girls showing up more frequently in stressed households or certain types of households than in other households. So there are all these mechanisms, and one advantage of our paper is that we're going to be able to rule out a bunch of these mechanisms. So through what we're going to do, I think we're going to be able to knock out a bunch of these. So we might not settle on the exact mechanism, but there are a bunch that we'll rule out, at least for the Netherlands. So what is our study? Our study is going to use registry data of all existing and new marriages in the Netherlands from 1995 until 2015. So when we begin processing the data, we start with about 2 million marriages. So we really don't need to show little stars for the things that we do. We're going to, as opposed to previous work that's worked with cross-section point-in-time data, we're going to have prospective longitudinal data where we follow the couples over time. We're going to estimate prospective longitudinal models that account for the changing risks of divorce over the course of a marriage and as children age. We're going to be able to control for some other things that haven't been accounted for in previous studies. So we'll have characteristics of the parents, some other characteristics that we can put into the model. And a big feature of the study is going to be how divorce risks change as the children age. So one thing that I'm going to want you to think about is a different type of duration dependence. So typically for a marriage study, we'd think about duration duration dependence in terms of the duration from the time that the marriage starts until whatever happens in the marriage. But here we're going to focus on the time from the time when the firstborn child appears, or maybe subsequent children, and that time going forward. That's also going to be a duration process, and we're going to focus on that process while taking a look at some other processes. So contributions from the paper, we're going to have great measures of the key variables here. So we know the exact date of the wedding, we know the exact date of the divorce, we know the exact dates of the births. So we don't have to rely on self-reported data. All of the previous research that's been done in the US uses self-reports. And it turns out that these self-reports are not so great, that there is a modest amount of error in the self-reports. So you would think that people would be able to report the birth dates of their children, their marital histories, but there's actually a modest amount of error in that reporting, especially in divorce reporting. So lots of people fail to report previous marriages and fail to report divorces after they happen. Again, this is going to be prospective, so we're going to follow people over time, measure things over time. We don't need a bunch of retrospective reports.
What did you mean by divorce processes? Several of the previous studies did not specifically examine divorce processes.
So, for instance, the Dahl and Moretti study, their principal outcome is whether a child is living with both of her parents at a particular point in time. So if a child isn't living with her parents, it might be because the parents divorced, but it might also be because the parents never married. The child may have been born and may have been living on her own. Well, you know, all sorts of things could have happened after the child was born rather than the child being born in. So we're actually going to look at actual divorces rather than some other outcome associated with divorces.
If they are not married and then they get out of the thing, and could you consider divorce or just one of those?
We will be able to account for that. So in the Netherlands, there are two formal ways that you can live together. So two sort of legal arrangements. One is marriage. The other is a registered partnership. And our data will consider both marriages and registered partnerships. But you could also live together informally. And we've done sensitivity analyses where we take a look at cohabitation as well. With marriages and divorces or registered partnerships, we know the exact day that they started and the day that they ended because they have to be registered with the Dutch authorities. With the cohabitation, it's a little tougher, but we have the household rosters on a year-by-year basis, and we can just follow who somebody's living with. So instead of doing it with a specific day, we know the year that you began living together and the year that you separated. It doesn't make any difference. We can also use the living together data. We're going to focus on registered divorce outcomes, but it's possible that the couple separated before the divorce. We can use the household composition data to account for separation. It doesn't change any of our results. Again, we're going to have some really cool parental background data that we can get out of these. So I think that's one of the neat things in the paper. And then we're also going to take a look at two other data sources. So one is a longitudinal data set on attitudes and other things within households. So that's the lists data. And then we're also going to do some replication analyses using the current population survey marriage and fertility supplements. So the outline is I'm going to go through the theory, then I'll describe the registry data, and then I'll just jump into the different sets of results. So what's our theory here? Well, the theory that we're going to use is just a simple rational choice model of marriage and divorce. So in the simple rational choice model, parents consider essentially the benefits of being married, so the net utility associated with being married versus the net utility associated with outside options. Utility is going to be defined over the things that the parents can consume, so just regular consumer goods. You can think of this mostly as income or total expenditures. They're also going to be concerned about match-specific investment goods, so in this case children. Children will have a value associated with them, and then also a match-specific quality. Parents compare the utility that they get from these things if they're, well, I should say, a couple would compare the things that they can get within marriage to the outside options. They do this on a period-by-period basis, where some of the things are not known in the future. So you don't quite know how your match-specific quality is going to evolve. You don't quite know how your kids are going to turn out and what the value associated with that is. You don't quite know what each of the partners is going to be able to bring to the marriage in terms of consumption possibilities. And then you also don't quite know what your outside opportunities are going to be in the future. So these decisions are made on a period-by-period basis. And the main thing that falls out of this model as an explanation for divorce is that something unexpected has to happen. So if people are forward-looking and they come together and form a marriage, when they made that decision to get married, they've taken all the future, at least what they expect in the future, into account in forming the marriage. Why would a marriage break up? Well, it had to be something that they didn't foresee before. So it either has to be a significant negative realization in something that affects the value of marriage, or it's got to be a significant, a large positive valuation in something outside of marriage. But the standard rational choice model of marriage is that there's some unexpected realization that comes up that shifts the value of outside versus inside options. Right.
So two questions on that. First, in terms of how you're thinking about this house or this household utility model, is it that I have my own utilities based on just me personally, or do I take my partner and my child's utility as arguments to my utility function? Or are we just thinking about one household, thinking about kind of individual decision makers? Like, is the household operating as one unit, saying, okay, on net, we're separating, or do you have kind of like a bargaining process between the two?
We don't really specify. What the process is,
Okay.
and I don't know that it makes that much of a difference for divorce.
I think so. In terms of observing divorce, I would agree, except for I wonder if some of these mechanisms, in terms of the son preference versus, I don't know, maybe one of the cost mechanisms, and you might fall out if there's a bargaining process and you have, if you have difference in preferences, you might see on that dimension.
So yeah, the thing that we think about in terms of the bargaining process is, that it might be possible if one person prefers and the other doesn't care. One might be able to make a transfer across, but you're still put in a position where somebody has to make a transfer,
Right.
And that should weaken the incentives to stay married.
Okay. And then the other thing is, you say that what's required is we need some kind of sufficiently negative, unexpected realization within the marriage, or some sufficiently positive, unexpected realization outside of the marriage. Having a daughter is not exactly a low probability event, right? For having, conditional on your decision to have children.
It happens.
Yeah, sure. So is this? I'm trying to think of how just having this daughter can be a.
Hold that thought.
Okay. All right.
So we'll try to talk through what the mechanisms are. And even if something has a pretty high probability, the realization of a random event is going to be different from the expectation of that random event. So
Sure, but the probability associated with that is still pretty high.
Yeah.
Is there any difference in divorce initiated by the wife or initiated by the man? Because we're talking about the...
Yeah, we'd like to be able to examine that. We don't have that in the Dutch data, so we can't tell who initiated the divorce. In the Netherlands, from starting in 1971, the Netherlands has unilateral no-fault divorce. So either party can unilaterally break up the marriage, and the only grounds for breaking up a marriage are irreconcilable differences. So as soon as somebody declares that, you can go through with divorce. Yep.
Could you see who remarries first, and would that maybe be a signal of who decided to end the marriage?
We could take a look at that. We haven't looked past the existing marriages, so we've done everything within the existing marriages. So let's run through a couple of these and just show you how we get from son preferences or some of these other things to actual divorces. So let's just start with an overarching preference for sons. What would an overarching preference for sons do? Well, recall that one of the elements in the valuation of marriage is the valuation over the marriage-specific good. If the marriage-specific good is children, and boys are preferred to girls, that increases the valuation of the marriage-specific good and should actually weaken the incentives for divorce. Another mechanism here is that fathers might prefer spending time with sons. It's going to be easier to spend time with sons if you're in proximity to your son. So the valuation of the father's valuation of marriage-specific capital might go up in that case. But that's an increase in marriage-specific capital, and that might change the incentives as well. There's also evidence that fathers prefer spending time with sons when their sons are school-aged rather than when the sons are infants. If that's the case, that would certainly increase the valuation of marriage-specific capital over those years. But in order to get to those years, you would have to stay within the marriage. Those would also be anticipated effects. So we would expect marriages to be strengthened in those years, but we'd also expect marriages to be strengthened before that because the anticipation of being able to take that. So you're going to see a bunch of these arguments, and one of the things that we're going to distinguish between are things that might be anticipated versus things that are unanticipated. Because remember that with the marriage model that we proposed, it's the unanticipated things that lead to divorce, less so the anticipated things. Caveats. So I don't know who's not an economist, not part of the tribe here. But obviously the embedded assumptions here are that people are forward-looking, that they're rational in their behavior. So if people are myopic, if people are not completely rational, then you get other dependencies. Cost hypothesis. It's hard to think of girls really costing more in a developed country setting, but there is some evidence that they might. So Robert Moffat and I have a study in the US that shows that girls are less likely to experience food hardships than boys are. So boys are associated with bigger food hardships in households. There's some evidence that food resources might be transferred to girls rather than to boys. There's some experimental evidence where people were asked to play the role of a parent and then given a bunch of scenarios, and it turns out that parents transferred more resources to girls, so these hypothetical parents, to girls than they did to boys, boys, and they were more likely to do so to teenage girls than teenage boys. So maybe there are cost differences between boys and girls. There is some evidence when children are younger that parents spend more time with girls than boys. They spend more time reading to girls than to boys. Another type of cost, and if one gender or the other cost more, that's going to reduce the investments in the marriage-specific good. Less of the marriage-specific good means a higher risk of divorce. There's also some evidence that sons might be more vulnerable in the cases of divorce, that they may have worse emotional and behavioral outcomes if their parents are divorced. So Shelley Lundberg has a great paper describing boys as little orchids that basically are too delicate. And if that's the case, then that would reduce the outside options. So if you got divorced, there'd be higher costs associated with the outside divorce options, and that might reduce the probability of divorce. And again, for both of these hypotheses, there is some evidence of age differences. So of some of these effects possibly kicking in when the kids are school-aged or teenaged. Again, the caveat with these is, are these cost or time differences anticipated or not anticipated? So if there's just a general sensitivity of boys to divorce, then that's going to be an anticipated change. However, you might discover over time that you have one of these orchids that needs to be protected, in which case it would be an unanticipated change. Sociologists focus more on the family processes, though sociologists also recognize some of the other arguments that we've described. We've already mentioned greater father involvement, but father involvement may change processes within the household. So greater father involvement may mean that the father is just more in touch with the household. It may facilitate communication, other processes within the household. So that may strengthen the household. But anybody who's gone through retirement can also tell you that having fathers or husbands around in the household might actually disrupt processes. So if the father gets involved in things that fathers normally don't get involved in, then it could be disruptive. So this could go either way.
Now, you can still have a rational choice model, and you don't necessarily have to follow Becker in assuming that unexpected changes would cause divorce. You could have rational people who decide they want to be married for as long as, they raise kids together, and they may, plan in advance that the marriage won't last. And it could be that they anticipate the girls to mature earlier because, that's a fact that they marry earlier on average, and they, many of the indications of maturity are faster for girls. So they figure, one explanation for the higher divorce rate could be that anticipated divorce led them to figure, well, my daughter is ready to, she's already a lady, I don't have to be here anymore. And one of the parents decides this is it, it's time to go. And not so quickly for men, for boys.
Yeah, in presenting the model, I present the model in very broad strokes, and it is possible that you could go into a marriage anticipating that you would stay married for a particular period of time. And that would get into the anticipated versus unanticipated story. So we can't, we can motivate that partly, but again, there are a whole bunch of caveats on the anticipated versus unanticipated. We do know for sure that there would need to be some sort of an age-varying condition or time-varying condition. It's easiest to motivate this in terms of an unanticipated condition. But if parents are only looking at marriage as a short-term solution, then maybe there's rational divorce with an anticipated effect. Yep.
Could you sort of tease that out by looking only at people with grown children to see then, because if Shashan's explanation were correct, then you should see similar rates of divorce between...
We do. We'll have grown children. They'll be here. They'll show up. Some other processes. Another process is that being exposed to girls. So in households with girls, fathers tend to have more egalitarian attitudes. So the presence of the girl changes attitudes. Presence of girls also changes political attitudes. So one of the things that changes is your militarism. So fathers of girls are more militaristic than fathers of boys, because fathers of boys, their children are more likely to be at risk. So there is actually a political science literature that uses the gender composition of children as a instrument for attitude changes. Children may also cause relationship strains. So the relationships between parents and children may change as the children age, and there may be differences between the relationships with of parents with daughters versus parents of sons. And if relationships are more stressful with daughters, then that could be a source of stress for the relationship as well. Again, several of these might be anticipated, but a lot of these processes are actually unanticipated. So you might not anticipate the relationship strains with a daughter. Selection. This is a...
In all of that, you did not bring the problem of finance.
Well, we have it with costs.
Causes for the divorces is a lack of funding within the household.
So why, can you tease that out a little bit more about why you think that would be different for parents of daughters and sons?
I think, if, for example, if there are only two daughters in the house, then their satisfaction depends upon how the daughters are going to be developing. When you have a man, on a boy or a girl, then there is a question of comparing those things comes up.
Okay.
So as a result of that I would say that the divorce rate among those families where there are only girls present may not be more than what you would see any other place. And then people take into consideration. I think another thing also is that when you get married, you are not going to say, I'm going to get separated in 10 years or 5 years. You are married until the last days of your life, at least. The expectation to remain.
Well, again, this is what Shoshan was arguing, that there might be some couples who don't operate that way and look at marriage as a temporary or time-limited arrangement.
But in any event, that I think finance definitely gets into consideration here. But I didn't hear that when you were talking about it, yeah.
Okay. So selection. There is some evidence that girls survive more stressful conditions in utero than boys do. So boys are more likely to be miscarried than girls. And the argument goes that stressful marriages could actually be triggers for miscarriage, and the miscarriages may occur more frequently among boys than girls. So the appearance of a girl might actually be a marker for more stressful marriages. So pre-existing stress might predict this. And there's a study that came out in 2014 in demography that found exactly this, that stress within marriages actually predicted whether girls would be born versus boys. There's some other evidence related to the stress hypothesis that shows that gender ratios change with certain predictable conditions. So for instance, the overall gender ratio is 1.05 boys per every girl. But those parities tend to close the older that the mother is. And the thought there is that at older ages, that's a more stressful in uterine environment, which would favor girls over boys. There's some other patterns that you can see with gender composition, and that suggests that there might be some pre-existing conditions that lead to gender composition.
Your data isn't probably rich enough to try and look for that in this Dutch context.
We're going to reject that hypothesis. So one of the things that would happen if there's a selection process is that you would see gender composition associated with divorce right at the time that the child's born, or near the time that the child's born. So that would be if it's pre-existing stress, then what you would see is a daughter-son difference early in the child's life, not just late in the child's life. So we're gonna deduct from the age pattern that we observed that selection's not present. And we've got some other evidence that suggests that selection.
I can tell a story with an abusive relationship that is bad and continues to be bad for a long period of time.
And anytime you hear that story, you should tell it. So everybody should report those stories.
Right.
It's a joke. It's funny. Go ahead.
But in that case, you wouldn't necessarily see, it would be a stressful environment, it would be stressful for a long time.
Well, it certainly, we would expect that would be stressful in the time period near the birth of the child.
Right. And if it was kind of this, a setting where the mother didn't feel comfortable leaving until the child was a little bit older, regardless boy or girl, right? I mean, this is a stretch, but you would lead to the same empirical outcome, right?
No. You would imagine that there would be a distribution of mother types in terms of when they would be willing to leave or break up a marriage. And while some might be willing to stay within the marriage for a while, you'd expect that there would be some that would want to break up earlier. So you'd still...
you look for that right way, saying that to break up.
So hold on to that question. Let me put up the graphs, and then you can see if you've still got that concern. So we're going to use municipal registries. So we've got access to, again, all the marriages and divorces in the Netherlands. Marriages and divorces are registered in the Netherlands. So to get married, you first have to formally make an announcement that you're going to get married. That has to precede the wedding by at least 2 weeks. That announcement is made publicly. When you get married, the first thing that happens is there's a civil ceremony. At the civil ceremony, that's when the marriage is registered. There may be a religious ceremony or some other type of ceremony that typically happens on the same day, but it would follow the civil ceremony. So you get married in a courthouse or someplace else first by a civil servant, and then that's followed by whatever other ceremony that you have. The neat thing with those data is the weddings are registered. And at that time, we know the exact date of the start of the wedding, or the marriage. Similarly, all divorces are registered within the Netherlands. So we have the exact date that a divorce went into effect.
Is there a similar sort of announcement waiting?
No. The Netherlands also has registered partnerships. The procedures for a registered partnership are nearly the same. There is a formal announcement that you're entering into a registered partnership. When the partnership is dissolved, the date of the dissolution is registered. The only limitation to the announcement is you can convert a registered partnership to a marriage. You don't have to make an announcement that you're, so that's the one limitation there. Dutch divorce law changed in 1971. As a result of that, we're only going to take a look at marriages after 1971. One other weird thing with respect to Dutch weddings and registered partnerships is in the late 1990s, when Dutch authorities began taking a look at the possibility of same-sex relationships. They relaxed the restrictions on registered partnerships to try to make registered partnerships more equivalent to marriages. So around the same time that they allowed same-sex marriage, they also created this weird condition for registered partnerships to put them on par with marriages. And the weird thing was that just like you could convert your registered partnership to a marriage, you could also convert your marriage to a registered partnership. The advantage of converting a marriage to a registered partnership is that registered partnerships can be dissolved without a court proceeding. So what the Dutch officials had inadvertently done was created a low-cost path to divorce. So in the Netherlands, the period where this is in effect was called the flash divorce period. What you would do is you would change your relationship to a registered partnership, then you'd immediately divorce. Divorce rates went up by about 20% over those years and then came down. And my colleague Jan is using that now as an instrument for divorce. So anytime you want to do something with divorce in the Netherlands, you've got to have time dummies in there to account for the flash divorce procedure. So, first question, is the gender of the firstborn children random? What we've done is we've taken a look at households in which there's a firstborn child, so that we've restricted ourselves. We're just going to take a look at children born after 1995 because we have a full set of controls for starting in 1995. And we're going to take a look at the characteristics of the household. We've got just over 1 million children that we can observe. So these are enormous sample sizes. And what I'm going to show you is really cool because we're going to compare the characteristics of households with firstborn sons versus firstborn daughters, and there's virtually no difference. So there's no statistical difference in the father's age. Again, this is with 1 million observations. So like any difference here is going to be significant. We don't find a significant difference. The parents' ages are the same. The marital durations when the births occur are the same. Immigrant status is the same. Whether the father or mother is employed, the mother or father's earnings in the calendar year before the birth are all the same. The share of firstborn children born outside of a marriage or registered partnership is the same, and the share born within registered partnerships is the same. So there's no evidence of selection, at least on the basis of these observable characteristics. There are only two characteristics that differ between the households with sons and daughters. The first is subsequent fertility. So in the households in which sons are born, there's lower subsequent fertility. There's higher subsequent fertility in the Netherlands. So opposite of what you might think from son preference, there's slightly higher, about 1% higher fertility in the households with sons than with daughters. So that's the opposite of what's been found in the US. The other difference, households with daughters are more likely to divorce. So there's a higher divorce rate. So we're now going to move to take a look at marriage spells. We're going to just consider first marriages. We're going to focus on different sex marriages, and we're going to focus on marriages that happen after 1971. We're going to drop marriages in which either spouse had a child with another partner, or in which an adoption occurred. We're also going to drop households in which the first births were twin births. Our reason for making these selections, after 1971, we want the same divorce regime, same basic divorce regime. The other restrictions are to eliminate the possibility of sex selection among the kids. So, for instance, if one of the spouses had a child with another partner, that could have been a factor in their decisions to marry. So we're just going to focus on first marriages, and again on what we could think of as exogenous gender selection. We're going to limit our analysis to partners who are born between 1935 and 1985. Our spells are going to be left censored at 1995. So at 1995, we will know the duration of the relationship, but we aren't going to have observed, we'll also know the ages of all the children, the age progression of all the children, but we don't have all the time varying characteristics before 1995. So we'll condition on duration starting in 1995, but we're not going to look at any other spell information before 95. And then our spells will be right censored if we reach the end of our observation window, if either of the spouses dies or emigrates, and we're going to artificially truncate things after 40 years of marriage and after the firstborn child reaches age 27. The reason for doing that is because of our other selection criteria. We just don't have very many observations past those. All the results I'm going to show you are not sensitive to minor changes in these selection criteria. So if you change the selection criteria by a few years here and there, it doesn't change anything. Okay, let's show some results. So, for this first study, our data set consists of all marriages, but for this first study, let's just focus on marriages in which there's a child. And for that, we're going to have couples with children, and we're going to take a look just at the years after the firstborn child is born. So what I'm trying to do here is to put together a Kaplan-Meier hazard, so a non-parametric hazard function, but where we're going to use the age since the child was born as the duration variable. We're not going to condition on anything else. So I just want to show you what the raw patterns are. Something that my advisor told me a very long time ago is if you can't show it in the first one or two descriptive slides, you probably don't have a result that's there. So I'm going to show you a pattern. It's going to show up here. It'll show up every other time that we look at things. So this is the unconditional hazard of divorce by the age of the child, so the time since the child was born. We're not conditioning on anything else. The red line is the hazards for couples with a firstborn daughter. The blue line is the hazard for firstborn sons. What you observe here is that there's an increasing risk of divorce initially as the children age, and then a decreasing risk of divorce. But the risks of divorce are exactly the same for sons and daughters up to the point where the children reach age 13. At that point, there's an elevated risk of divorce for daughters from 13 to 18, and then after that, the risks again collapse and are the same.
According to this graph, the divergence seems to start when the child is 11, after the child is 11. But maybe it's not significant.
So this is 11, this is 12, this is 13. So, this is within the margin of error. This is the same relationship here, just focusing on the difference. And what you can see here is that at 10, 11, and 12, there are some elevated risks that are there, but they're not significant. But once you reach age 13, from then on, there are significant differences. That's the paper. So this relationship that you see here, I'm going to throw all sorts of controls into things, but this relationship appears over and over again. Dave, you ask, how big are these differences? So one problem with taking a look at hazards is that hazard probability is the probability that somebody's going to divorce conditional on them having remained married up to a certain point in time. So these are conditional probabilities, and they're conditioned on lots of other events. It's very hard to tell what the actual magnitudes of the effects are. So here what we've done is we've computed the cumulative risks of divorce as the children age. And as you can see, there's no difference in the cumulative differences in divorce up until the point where the kids turn 13. And then after that, you see increasing risks of divorce up till age 19, and then no difference. So once you get out here, you're getting about 265 couples who are divorcing if the firstborn is boys out of 1,000, and you're getting 269 couples who are divorcing out of 1,000 if girls. So the relative difference here is a difference of about 1.5% in relative terms. Not a huge difference, but not not a negligible difference either. So by the time you get here, these are modest differences in the risk of divorce. So the first thing to point out here, and Ryan, you can take heart from this. It's not every couple. These are modest changes in the divorce risks, but they are noticeable differences. So by these being small differences, these are clearly things that are affecting some couples, but not affecting all couples. So next thing to do is to estimate multivariate models. So we're going to estimate full models of divorce. Here we're going to take our entire sample. So we're going to take the couples who never had kids. We're going to consider the years before kids appear. We're going to control for marriage duration, immigration background, age at marriage, whether this was a registered partnership, whether the birth occurred premaritally, the education of the couple will have cohort effects and year fixed effects. So put in lots of additional controls. I'm going to display the results, though, the same way that I displayed the last results. So these are the conditional hazards of divorce associated with the age of the firstborn child once you've controlled for other things. You can see that the controls are profoundly important. They've completely changed the shape of the distribution here. Now you get a shape that's a little more understandable, where the risks of divorce increase up until the time that the kids reach about age 19. They decrease afterwards. So that's consistent with previous research that shows the parents do tend to stay together for the sake of the kids, but also that there's an empty nest effect. So Ryan, this is something way out in the future, but at some point the kids leave the household. It ends up being a glorious time when it's a rough year or two when they leave, and then after that you can go and do anything that you want. It's just a great.
Usually people complain about having an empty nest, or it's perceived as something that creates problems, but from your data it looks like once the nest is empty,
things get better. things get better. Again, the risks here are higher than the risks were down here.
Right, but not as high as one
Yeah,
to home.
but the peak period for divorce is when the kids are 19 or 20, so right at the time that they leave, and then after that things get better. So we see this profound difference in the shape. What we don't see is a difference in the relative relationship. There's still an elevated risk associated with girls. It shows up at 13 and that lasts till age 18. So these relative differences are the same, even though the shape of this profile has changed. Yep.
Yeah, I was just kind of out of curiosity. I know you've limited your graph to end when the children turn 27. Does that trend kind of continue downward as the children are becoming just irrelevantly old? Or is the divorce?
We don't. We've extended it a little bit. So recall, one of the reasons why we're cutting the graph off there is that we artificially truncated the data there. So we don't have those estimates. But when we've changed things by a year or two, we still see the same things farther out.
And can you get the previous slide back? At the very end there, is that the blue line is a little bit above the red line? Is that significant difference?
No. So it's a bigger difference, but one of the things, so the farther out you go in an event history analysis, you've had more people transition out, and what happens is that the confidence bands get wider and wider. So even though this is a pretty big difference that's out here, the confidence band is pretty wide out there. And it's really just, these two observations here, a year before it's there, and that's, it's pretty high above there. So I think that's consistent with random noise.
Can you give a simple, intuitive explanation of why the pattern changes so dramatically between the unconditional and conditional?
Yeah, the big difference is we're now controlling for the duration of the marriage. So marriages tend to be strong early on. Then there's a increase in divorce risks typically over the first 5 to 7 years, and then there's a decrease there. And what we were picking up in the previous graph was a conflation of the duration, the general duration patterns for marriage, and then the ages for the kids. So the shape changes again if you control for higher parity children. The last graph that I showed did not control for higher parity children. We do control for them subsequently. Recall, so there's evidence from some other studies that firstborn daughters lead to more childbearing. We don't find that. But just to control for higher parity children, we ran analyses that included higher parity children. It doesn't change the relative picture. It makes our age pattern a little more shallow than it was before, but doesn't change the relative differences. These are the divorce hazards for higher parity children. So here, what we've got are indicators for the count of children at different parities. And what you can see is that the count of daughters who are teenagers is associated with higher risks. We do get one significant difference earlier for daughters, but we still see the same pattern that we had seen before. So we see the same pattern whether it's a firstborn daughter or a secondborn daughter. It's just a weaker pattern for the secondborn daughters. So the results that we've looked at so far seem to rule out a bunch of stories. So first of all, if there's a general gender preference, a general preference for sons, we would expect to see differences across the entire age range of the child, not just in those last years. If there are anticipated effects of changes. And if people marry for good, so you're the romantic, you're the one who thinks that they marry for good, and if they're forward-looking and other things, then you would also see differences across the life cycle, not in those particular years. The selection story. If there's selection present, you would expect to observe differences early in the distribution, maybe later as well, but you'd expect to see differences early. We don't see those differences. So the patterns that we have seem to rule out a bunch of the stories and seem to leave us focused on some type of a age-dependent thing that's happening with the child, and probably something that's unanticipated. Our working hypothesis, after taking a look at all of this, was that there was something going on with the relationships between the fathers and daughters. That seemed to be, or between the parents and daughters. That seemed to be something that might be unanticipated. We also thought that it might be something that's tied to gender role attitudes, where the source of the relationship strain might be differences in the gender role expectations of the parents versus daughters as something. So what we tried to do in a series of supplemental analyses is try to take a look at some subgroups where either the differences with the daughters might be more likely to be unexplained, so where there be worse expectations, so more likely that you're going to be shocked by what your daughter is doing, or where there might be more gender role differences. So we've broken our analyses into different subgroups and tried to look for relationship strains. Now, to do this, we estimated a simplified version of our model, where we had all the controls that we described before, but instead of having gender interactions at every single age, we just had a gender interaction for the years 0 to 12, then a gender interaction for 13 to 18, and then a gender interaction for 19 to 26. That's just so that we can display the results a little more cleanly. This is what our baseline set of results looks like when you do that, and you see that we get higher divorce risks, about a 5% higher hazard risk from 13 to 18, but no excess risks at 0 to 12 or 19 to 26. So one place where gender role differences might be larger is if the parents are immigrants, but the girl is a Dutch native. So all of our children were born in the Netherlands, but the parents might not have been. And the parents might come from backgrounds that have more traditional gender roles, or at least gender roles that differ. What we find is that the excess divorce risks are actually lower if both they're still present, but they're lower if both spouses are native. They're higher if both spouses are immigrants. They're higher still if one spouse is an immigrant and one spouse is a native. So in that case, there are two sources of tension regarding the daughter's gender role. They're highest if the husband is an immigrant and the wife is a native. Another thing that might be associated with either knowledge about how teenage girls are going to act or family processes, also with attitudes, is the level of education. And we might think that there are more traditional gender role attitudes in less educated households. And consistent with that, we find the highest divorce risks where the husband had less than high school, and relatively low risks if the husband had high school or more.
So what's your story for the finding about immigrant parents?
We think it's a source of gender role differences. So we think that the immigrant parents have traditional gender roles, so there's a wider divergence in the gender role attitudes of the parents versus the daughters.
The immigrant is from a different country or different race?
Here, the immigrants would be from a different country.
And you see this as unexpected. The tension that occurs between, let's say, the father and the daughter when she becomes a teenager was not expected on his part. He thought she would end up being acting according to his...
Well, we think that the thing that's pushing the tension is going to be larger in those households than some other households. So it's just a... Let's take a look at some other groups. You don't like that group? We'll go to another group.
Why do you find the difference between husband native, wife immigrant, and wife native, husband immigrant? And why do those marriages bring more?
Hold on to that thought.
Okay.
So another thing that might be associated with gender role attitudes is when the parents were born. So older cohort parents are likely to have more traditional attitudes than younger cohort parents. And we actually find that the highest differential appears for the oldest cohort of parents. Here's the one that I think starts to pin this on the fathers rather than just the parents generally. So here we're finding some evidence that it's the father that really matters. This is a really cool result. To match each of the parents to whether or not they had siblings, so long as they were Dutch natives. So this analysis here is limited to Dutch natives. And what we found is that the fathers who grew up with sisters, without sisters, are at elevated risk. Fathers who grew up with sisters have no elevated risk. So if you were exposed to teenage girls growing up, you're not at risk at all. If you weren't, then you are at risk. Here, the near age difference, I believe, is within a 10-year band. If we make it a 5-year band or a 15-year band, it doesn't matter. Actually, if we make it with sisters altogether, it doesn't matter. These are sisters through the mother. So these are maternally linked sisters. It doesn't matter if you make these paternally linked sisters or if you consider all possible combinations of sisters. You still get the same general types of patterns, though the magnitudes change. Fathers growing up with sisters makes a difference. Sisters growing up with brothers does not make a difference, which again leads us to think that this is a daddy issue more than a mommy issue.
Sorry. So a couple of thoughts. One is, have you looked at the age difference between the husband and wife as a factor?
Good point.
We have not. What's the thought there?
Maybe parents who are farther apart in age might also have more tension when there's kind of an unexpected shock. Younger mothers may be kind of more likely to side with the daughter versus an older generation father.
Okay.
I would add...
So our results account for a linear difference because we've already controlled for the ages of each of the... So we've already got that in there.
Right.
In our other paper, there is this problem of trying to come up with differences between the spouses. So we can't just enter a linear difference in because we've already accounted for these. We've already accounted for all the spouses' characteristics, all the... But
maybe with a more, like, parents with maybe more than a 10.
So what we put in the other paper is generalized quadratic difference.
Okay.
And when you put the quadratic difference, it's a dissimilarity index, and the dissimilarity index is really predictive.
Okay.
So what we could do is take a look at more similar versus dissimilar.
Okay.
So, and the dissimilar parents are at really high risk of divorce.
Right.
Now, you also have religion data?
No.
You don't?
No, not in the census. So we've got information. We have put in controls for region of residence. So the Netherlands has a Bible Belt. And divorces are less likely in the Bible Belt than they are outside the Bible Belt, but we don't find other differences in these patterns.
This doesn't change with Bible Belt.
No, so that's not different in the Bible Belt.
I was just going to add, is there any notable difference if, like, the father had a brother or if the mother had a sister? Does that come into play at all?
There's a little bit of a difference in the composition for mothers, not for fathers. So for fathers, who are the husbands with no near-age sisters? They're only children and husbands with brothers. And for both groups, you get about the same result. And then the husbands with sisters, it's husbands only with sisters and husbands with a mix, and both of them have results that are similar. So collapsing things this way shows you the real results. I can't remember which group there's one wife combination that's different from the other combinations where you don't observe a difference there. Okay, I'm going to rush through these next results because we've got I think we're actually over time. But these are analyses from a panel in which people were actually asked about their relationships and attitudes with people in the house. So these are analysis of a set of subjective questions that were asked of parents. And here, what I've got are coefficients on interactions between the child being a girl and the child being in one of these ages. You'll see that mothers report more disagreements with their partners regarding money if daughters are present, and slightly higher if the girls are teenagers. The mothers are reporting more differences with their partners regarding raising children. If the children are daughters who are 13 or higher. Consistent with children changing attitudes, you see that the presence of a daughter leads to more egalitarian attitudes for the parents, especially when the girls are teenagers. So that should reduce some risks. You see that divorce ideation is higher among mothers if they have teenage daughters. No general differences in married people being happier. Fathers reporting worse relationship quality if they have daughters, teenage daughters. Care responsibilities in terms of a cost. Mothers are reporting more care responsibilities for younger daughters than for older daughters. That seems to rule out a care or cost explanation. And then life satisfaction, mothers of daughters generally reporting lower life satisfaction. So we're seeing a little bit more evidence of relationship strains, partner strains, especially when the girls are 13 to 18.
Are you able to look at teenage fertility as an explanation for that, given the age?
That's on our to-do list, is to take a look at. We don't think that that's a good explanation. And the reason is there's not that much teenage fertility at 13.
At 13.
So our differences are appearing at 13. They're there through 18. Teenage fertility really doesn't start showing in big numbers until the girls get to be 16, 17, 18. There are some girls who become moms at 13 and younger, but it's a very small fraction.
Do you have information on who initiated the divorce?
No, we don't. So we can't tell.
Because the last line in what you were showing showed that the mothers were more likely to be unhappy and increasingly unhappy as their daughters age, whereas the fathers did not, there was no significant effect there.
Right. So we also have for teenage children within these households, they report the quality of the relationships with the parents. So all of our teenagers here are 16 to 18, so we can't do the age differences because we don't have the younger children self-reporting. Here we have them describe the relationship with their father and with their mother. Teenage girls are reporting worse relationships with their father, not with their mother. We see this whether we just consider firstborn daughters or older daughters. So there seems to be some evidence of worse relationships among the children and amongst the parents in households where there are teenage daughters.
And this is limited to Dutch only?
Not quite. So the next thing that we did, we could go to the current population survey marriage and fertility supplements. The marriage and fertility supplements in 1980, 90, 1980, we also have 85 data here, 90 and 95, had a particular structure. And they asked about the first 3 marriages that somebody had experienced and the first 5 children. The problem with the CPS is that the sample sizes are modest. So the overall CPS at this time would have covered about 60,000 households. So these are smaller sample sizes. There's some difference in who was asked the questions in the CPS marriage and fertility supplements. And unfortunately, the Census Bureau, in its infinite wisdom, stopped asking these questions in the subsequent marriage and fertility supplements. So we have data through 1995. We don't have data after that. We're going to restrict our analyses to women who are married after 16 and before 45. We're going to take a look at first marriages. We're going to use the same model that I just showed you in the other analyses where we have the age-restricted dummies in there. These are the results for the US. No differences in divorce risks when the kids are 0 to 12. A difference when the kids are 13 to 18. So this is a gender dummy interacted with the ages, and no difference from 19 to 26. Now with the US data, these are our confidence intervals. So we've got relatively imprecise estimates, but we still see some confirmatory evidence there. So again, our key findings here, we do find evidence of a gender difference in divorce risk, but the gender difference only appears when the kids are 13 to 18. There's no evidence of differences before and no evidence after. The differences appear for firstborn children, but they also appear for higher parity. It doesn't seem to be a first child thing. In terms of our explanation, we seem to rule out general preferences for sons, we rule out selection, and we rule out most anticipated changes, again, subject to some caveats. There appears to be something that's age-related that's here. We think it's something that's age-related that's unanticipated in the household. And we think that relationship strains are probably the best explanation. We do find some other evidence that's consistent with relationship strains. We don't find any evidence that's consistent with the other explanations. So we're not finding evidence of more time needs for children, higher costs for children, things like that.
How did you test the high costs explanation?
We don't have, I don't think I had the data up here, but in the paper there was a question how much you spent on children. The problem there is it's how much do you spend on your children 15 and younger. But we don't see any difference in those data. And again, we did see differences in time costs, but it's when the girls were younger, not when they're older. So we do find some evidence that's consistent with relationship strains. But again, it's indirect evidence regarding relationship strengths. So, and we owe a thank you for Statistics Netherlands for providing the data. The University of Melbourne and the Center of Excellence for Children and Families over the Life course, who provide these data, and a whole bunch of people who've, now including you, who've provided helpful comments. So, any other questions? Yeah.
Do you think if you had the proper data for other European countries that you would get the same result?
We're not sure. We would be interested in looking at that and trying to find...
Nobody else has such good data,
The
right?
Scandinavians have the same kind of data.
So the catch with using these data is country by country you have to set up your relationship to get the data. So our access to the data comes through Jan, who's established these relationships with the Netherlands, but we would be looking, if any of you have access to Scandinavian data.
Salvanes could get you access to, what is it, Norway, Sweden?
Yeah, we might be able to get Norway. The Swedish data would be good. So we'd like to do that, but we'd like to get the paper published first. So getting the data, I think, would be, I think we're looking 6 to 12 months of work to get that.
One thought, so 13 is too early for fertility, but maybe that's around the time when girls in the Netherlands start dating. Maybe that could be one kind of source of tension.
Yep.
And then in terms of the cost, is it possible, so you're measuring through age 15, sort of what's the age when teenagers can start working in the Netherlands? Could it be that boys are more likely to have part-time jobs outside of school than girls, and therefore they don't need as many resources?
Yeah, that's a thought. So we can take a look at that. That's actually easy for Jan to look at because his dissertation actually took a look at, so the Netherlands has different minimum wages as you age. So the same way the US has a sub-minimum wage for teenagers, the Netherlands has a minimum wage, but it goes up each year as you age.
A region?
No, it's national, but what Jan found was that people were more likely to be fired in the days immediately preceding their birthday than on other days. So he's got another paper, Happy Birthday, You're Fired. But because of that, he has looked at the employment data, so that would be easy for us to look at.
I just had another quick question about looking at the number of children total within a family. I would think there's probably arguments in both directions for having more children, how that might affect your rates of divorce. At first glance, it feels like maybe having more children would reduce your rate of divorce because you have higher internal costs to divorce, and you presumably, if you're having more children, you think the relationship's going well, perhaps. But then also maybe if there's some sort of, if you have both girls and boys, does that influence the potential for divorce and higher sunk costs?
So for the models in which we have controls for higher parity children, we've controlled for the number of children. So we've got those general controls. We control for the gender of the children. One thing that we haven't looked at yet, though, is gender combinations of children. So that's also on the to-do list. So to see if the effect for girls is different if there's already a boy present, or the effect of boys is different, or the effect for girls is different if they follow the birth of a boy or precede the birth of a boy.
Thank you so much, Dave. It's great.
Thanks.
Just an announcement for next week's seminar is also going to be on Tuesday at this same time. Okay, so I'll send out emails about that paper. Yeah, it'll be Ryan Brown from the University of Colorado that'll be here next week. Thanks.